I slammed on the brakes so hard I nearly dented my steering wheel. It was early morning, the sun just barely creeping over the rooftops, and I had no idea what to make of the sight before me. 5 massive shipping containers lined up across my driveway, like I'd suddenly been transported to some industrial port yard. The containers weren't just near my driveway. They were perfectly placed to block my car from entering or exiting, forming a makeshift barrier as tall as my garage roof. I sat there in shock, my headlights illuminating the enormous metal walls. My heart started pounding. Who on earth thought this was acceptable? I killed the engine and stepped out onto the curb. The crisp morning air nipped at my cheeks, but the shock kept me warm. At first, I wondered if there'd been some colossal mistake. Maybe a trucking company got their delivery address scrambled. But within seconds, I saw the tiny laminated sign taped to the corner of the first container. It bore the official letterhead of the Huntington Park Homeowners Association, my HOA. My blood began to boil. The HOA and I had a tense relationship, to say the least. They'd never liked that I insisted on certain unapproved improvements to my home. I once tried to paint my front door a cheerful teal color, but they forced me to revert it to neutral beige or face a fine. I'd planted a row of bright flowers along the sidewalk, only to have them tear out my bedding plants and replace them with water-saving gravel. Every time, they acted like they had the moral high ground, spouting regulations and quotes from some thick rulebook that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics. But this was a new level of lunacy. Blocking my driveway with shipping containers was beyond petty. It was borderline malicious. My breath billowed in the cold air as I walked along the giant steel walls. A single sheet of paper flapped in the breeze, taped to one container with the HOA's official seal. Notice of violation and encumbrance. Pursuant to Huntington Park HOA Bylaws Section 7.2b, the occupant at 114 Maple Terrace is in violation of landscaping and setback ordinances. Until compliance is achieved, access to the property by vehicle is hereby restricted. Signed, Board of Directors, Huntington Park HOA. I actually laughed out loud, equal parts fury and disbelief. Landscaping and setback ordinances? So they'd physically blocked me from my house as punishment for some invented violation? This had to be illegal, even by the twisted standards of an HOA that thrived on intimidation. Of course, it didn't help that I'd recently made some updates to my backyard. I'd installed a new greenhouse, expanded my vegetable garden, and built a small workshop shed near the fence line. Yes, maybe I skirted around the formal approval process. But these structures weren't hurting anyone. I was proud of my garden, especially after retirement. I had more time to cultivate heirloom tomatoes, tinker with carpentry in my shed, and enjoy the fruits of my labor. The HOA, however, had other ideas. They'd been sending me terse warnings for weeks, threatening large fines if I didn't remove unauthorized structures. I fired back, demanding they show me where it explicitly said I couldn't build a greenhouse. The bylaws were vague, I argued. I refused to tear down something that was fully on my property and hurting no one. But that morning, it seemed they decided to go for the nuclear option, physically restrict my property access until I complied. As I stood there, half stunned, I realized something else. My wife's car was in the garage. She worked nights at the local hospital, and she'd be home soon. How would she even get into the driveway? And what if there was an emergency? Anger surged through my veins. I whipped out my phone, intending to call the police. But before I could dial, a second thought hit me. Did the HOA have some special arrangement with local authorities that might hamper immediate action? The city police often avoided HOA disputes, directing them to civil court. I might be stuck in legal red tape for weeks if I relied on that route. Still, I figured it was worth at least reporting. So I dialed the non-emergency line, my breath steaming in the cold. After 10 minutes on hold, I finally spoke to a dispatcher who took down the details. The response was predictably lukewarm. We'll send an officer to check the situation. But if it's on private property, it might be a civil matter. My stomach churned. This was my own driveway, for crying out loud. The idea that I'd have to wait around for an uncertain legal conclusion infuriated me. The HOA's arrogance was astounding. They believed they could do anything in the name of enforcement. I marched back into my car, reversed away from the containers, and parked on the street. As I stared at the big, ugly steel boxes blocking my home, I resolved that I would not cave. Not this time. If the HOA wanted a war, they'd get one, but on my terms. I locked my car, squared my shoulders, and began planning my next move. A lifetime of dealing with bullies taught me that sometimes, if you want to win, you need a strategy that's as unrelenting as your opponent. And if those shipping containers were meant to intimidate me, I'd turn them into the biggest headache the HOA had ever faced. The first thing I did was gather my paper trail, every notice, letter, and email the HOA had ever sent me. For the next few hours, I sat at my dining room table, flipping through a binder filled with warnings about unapproved modifications, fence height discrepancies, unacceptable color choices, and so on. I organized them chronologically, highlighting all the inconsistencies and vague language. My logic was simple. If I had to go toe-to-toe in a legal sense, I wanted every crumb of evidence. But more importantly, I needed to find angles, places where the HOA had overstepped or contradicted themselves. But my trouble wasn't just about the greenhouse or the workshop. I recalled an older spat about the common area maintenance that the HOA had neglected for months. A few years prior, I'd politely asked them to remove a dead tree that was half on my property and half on community land. They ignored me until it fell during a storm and smashed part of my roof. Guess who had to foot the bill? Events like that fueled my determination. The shipping containers were just the latest and most audacious example of their disregard for any sense of fairness. Around noon, a squad car finally drove up the street. I walked outside to greet the uniformed officer, a tall, broad-shouldered woman with a no-nonsense expression. She took one look at the containers and let out a low whistle. "I've seen some HOA disputes," she said, "but never shipping containers blocking a driveway." "Same here," I replied dryly. "Can you do anything?" She took down notes, asked a few questions. Eventually, she nodded sympathetically. "I can file a report and speak to them, but if these containers are on the HOA's property line, or if it's considered a civil issue over easements, my hands might be tied." I sighed, thanking her anyway. She promised to talk to the HOA president if she could, but I could see in her eyes that she doubted it would accomplish much. Later that afternoon, my wife, Sandra, arrived home. She parked on the street because her path was literally barricaded. I saw her face darken at the sight. "This is insane," she muttered, slamming the car door. "Have they lost their minds?" I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Oh, they're definitely out of their minds. But I'm not letting them bully us." Sandra was used to the HOA's petty antics, but even she seemed unnerved by the sheer hostility of this move. We decided we'd call an attorney friend the next day to get some preliminary advice. Meanwhile, we had to figure out how to live with 5 giant shipping containers blocking our driveway. Over the next 24 hours, we found ourselves marooned in a bizarre standoff. Anytime I had to pick up groceries, I lugged them from the street up to the house. Our neighbor, Mr. Donnelly, came over to check on us. He was as outraged as we were. "Can't you just have a tow truck haul them off?" he asked. I shook my head. "They're locked tight, and they weigh a couple thousand pounds each. Plus, the HOA claims they have official reason for placing them here." Mr. Donnelly spat on the ground. "Unreal. They're messing with the wrong guy." He was right about that. I have a streak in me. Maybe call it stubbornness, maybe call it a sense of justice, that flares up when people cross a certain line. And this line had definitely been crossed. The next morning, I got a letter in the mail from the HOA, taped firmly to my front door. It read, in formal language, that until I removed the unapproved structures, the greenhouse and workshop, and paid a compliance fee for every month they'd been present, the shipping containers would remain. If I tried to remove them myself, they threatened me with a lawsuit for trespassing on HOA property. My hands shook with anger as I read the letter. They were basically holding my property hostage. But instead of losing my head, I realized this was the perfect chance to turn the tables. I remembered an old conversation with a retired real estate developer friend who once told me that HOAs, ironically, are often just as beholden to city ordinances and county codes as regular homeowners. If these containers violated any local safety or zoning rules, the HOA could be in big trouble. So I put on my detective hat. I spent the afternoon researching local regulations on large storage containers, especially in residential zones. I found all kinds of interesting tidbits. Typically, containers needed special permits, they couldn't block certain easements, and they definitely had to meet fire safety guidelines. That last part was particularly relevant. Blocking emergency vehicles from a driveway might be a direct violation of fire code. And if the HOA was ignoring such rules, the city fire marshal could force them to remove the containers immediately. A flicker of hope lit up inside me. It wouldn't be easy, bureaucracy never is, but if I could get the fire department to see that my driveway access was dangerously obstructed, the HOA might have no choice but to back down. I dialed the local fire marshal's office, explained the situation, and emailed them photos of the containers. The woman on the line sounded genuinely concerned. She said they'd send someone to investigate. It felt like the first real step toward regaining control. I had no illusions that the HOA would roll over easily. But if they were playing the game of technicalities, I'd use the same approach. That night, as Sandra and I ate dinner, we talked about how the neighborhood used to be so peaceful when we moved in 20 years ago. It seemed that every new board election brought in more draconian rules and self-important leaders who wanted to micromanage everything from holiday decorations to the color of your blinds. Yet no matter how many times we'd try to vote in sensible people, the intimidation factor, plus general apathy, kept the same bullies in power. We refused to let them break our spirit, though. As we finished our meal, I told Sandra about my plan to contact not just the fire department, but also the local news. If the HOA wanted a public showdown, maybe shining a spotlight on their outrageous behavior would force a change. But first, I wanted to see if the fire marshal's visit would yield immediate results. With any luck, those containers would be gone before the weekend. If not, I was prepared to keep pushing. 2 days later, a bright red fire inspector's truck rumbled up our street, lights flashing. I practically raced outside, hoping for some swift intervention. A stocky man in a navy blue uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyeing the shipping containers with a look that hovered somewhere between astonishment and exasperation. "You the homeowner?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Name's Grant Walker. Thanks for coming," I replied. He walked around the containers, jotting notes, occasionally shaking his head. "Well, Mr. Walker, you weren't kidding. This is a severe obstruction. If an ambulance or fire truck needed to reach your garage or the side of your home for any reason, they couldn't." He explained that local fire code demanded clear access to residential structures, especially driveways, so emergency vehicles could get close in a crisis. Blocking the driveway with immovable metal containers seemed like a blatant violation. I felt a surge of triumph. "So, does that mean you can order them to remove it?" He nodded, but not as firmly as I'd hoped. "Technically, yes. I can write up a notice of violation. They'll have a set time frame, usually 48 hours, to clear it. If they refuse, they could face fines, and we'd escalate to the city's legal department." "That sounds great," I said. "So I can expect them to move these ASAP?" He pursed his lips. "We'll see how they respond. Some HOAs comply quickly, others drag their feet. But if they ignore a notice, they're risking serious legal trouble." He left the scene after posting a bright orange notice on one of the containers, instructing the HOA to remove or relocate them immediately. I couldn't help but grin. The sight of that official summons felt like justice in the making. But, as the inspector had hinted, the HOA wasn't about to fold quietly. The very next day, a letter arrived from the board, stuffed in my mailbox, complete with their signature gold seal. It claimed they would review the fire marshal's notice, but insisted the containers were temporarily placed on a communal setback, not on my private property. They accused me of exaggerating the safety threat. My blood boiled again. They were doubling down, refusing to admit they were in the wrong. At that point, I decided to amplify the issue. I emailed our local news station, attached photos of the containers and the fire marshal's notice, and laid out the story. An HOA blocking a resident's driveway, ignoring fire code, and effectively holding the homeowner's property hostage until he tore down a greenhouse and workshop. A young reporter named Lily responded to me within a few hours. She sounded intrigued, and said her station was always looking for stories about out-of-control HOAs. She asked if I'd be willing to do an on-camera interview. At first, I hesitated. I'd never really wanted to be in the public eye. But I realized that shining a bright light on the HOA's abuses might be the only way to force them to back off. So, that weekend, Lily and a camera operator came to our street. They filmed the containers, interviewed me, and even got a brief statement from my neighbor Mr. Donnelly, who minced no words about the HOA's tyrannical behavior. "Folks at home won't believe this," Lily said, shaking her head. "It's so blatant." By Monday evening, the story aired during the local 6 p.m. news broadcast. Sandra and I watched it together, hearts pounding. The footage showed the towering containers, the bright orange fire marshal sticker, and a snippet of my interview. I was nervous about backlash. The HOA board, after all, wasn't known for taking criticism gracefully. They'd likely come at me even harder. But I felt a sense of relief, too. It wasn't just my word against theirs anymore. The entire community could see what was happening. Sure enough, the next morning, I got a flurry of text messages from neighbors, some supportive, some curious, a few outraged on my behalf. One older couple, the Petersons, confided they'd been bullied by the HOA in the past, but never fought back. "We're proud of you for standing up," they wrote. However, I also got an ominous note from a board member. I recognized the name as Gary Novak, the HOA vice president. He wrote, "Grant, you're making a spectacle out of private community affairs. This is not how neighbors resolve disputes. We insist you remove your unapproved structures immediately, or we will consider further enforcement actions." Further enforcement actions. The phrase made my skin crawl. Were they going to take more drastic steps? Actually fence me out of my own property? Turn off my water somehow? They seemed capable of almost anything. That afternoon, I heard a commotion outside. I peered through the window to see 2 men in suits standing in front of the containers, gesturing animatedly at them. One was Gary Novak. The other was presumably some lawyer or consultant. They had official-looking paperwork. For a moment, I dared to hope that maybe they were there to remove the containers. But my hopes were dashed when they just slapped another sign next to the orange fire marshal's notice. I snuck out later to read it. It said, "Official notice, HOA property. Unauthorized removal of these containers will result in legal action. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I crumpled the paper in my hands, anger flaring. They were essentially spitting in the face of the fire marshal's order. I dialed the fire marshal's office again, updated them on the HOA's refusal to comply. The woman on the line told me they'd escalate the matter and contact the city attorney for follow-up. "It might take a bit of time," she warned. "But rest assured, we take these violations seriously." Time. That was the one thing I didn't want to waste. The shipping containers were still an eyesore, still blocking my driveway. And the longer they stayed, the more it felt like the HOA was winning, like they could do whatever they wanted. But as frustration gnawed at me, I remembered how many neighbors had reached out. The local news piece had lit a fire under people. Maybe if we banded together, we could put pressure on the HOA board. They couldn't retaliate against everyone, could they? That evening, I made some calls, arranged a small meeting at my house. A handful of neighbors came by for coffee, each with their own story of how the HOA had wronged them. Unjust fines, petty citations, arbitrary rule changes. We hatched a plan to confront the board en masse at the upcoming monthly meeting. If the board refused to remove the containers, we'd demand a vote to recall them. It felt risky. HOAs are often run by a tight-knit group. But seeing my driveway barricaded by massive steel boxes every day fueled my resolve. If we were going down, we'd go down swinging, and maybe take their petty tyranny with us. The night of the HOA's monthly meeting arrived with a tense atmosphere. Usually, these meetings took place in a modestly sized community room, attended by only a handful of residents. This time, word had spread about the shipping containers fiasco, and a larger crowd showed up. Neighbors I hadn't spoken with in years, couples who typically avoided drama, even folks from the next street over. I arrived early with Sandra and Mr. Donnelly. We quietly took seats near the front, scanning the room. At exactly 7 p.m., the board members emerged from a side door, wearing stiff expressions. Gary Novak took the seat at the center, acting as chair since the HOA president was apparently out of town. I suspected the real president didn't want to face the growing backlash in person. Gary shuffled some papers. "Let's call this meeting to order," he said, avoiding eye contact with the crowd. The usual agenda items droned on: landscaping budgets, pool maintenance schedules, an upcoming social event for the neighborhood. Finally, we reached open forum, the part where residents could speak. Before Gary could even finish his sentence, half a dozen hands shot up. One by one, neighbors voiced their concerns, some about the containers, others about the board's heavy-handed tactics in general. The tension in the room rose steadily. The board members tried to downplay it, claiming ongoing negotiations and necessary enforcement measures. Then it was my turn. I stood, cleared my throat, and made direct eye contact with Gary Novak. "Gary, for the past 10 days, my driveway has been blocked by 5 huge shipping containers. The fire marshal issued an official notice to remove them. Your board refused. My family and I can't park in our own driveway. If an ambulance needed to get to us, it couldn't." A few neighbors murmured agreement. I continued, my voice steady. "You claim this is about violations in my backyard, but that doesn't justify blocking a homeowner's access or ignoring fire code. The question is, are you going to remove those containers, or are you going to risk fines, lawsuits, and a possible recall by the community?" Gary's cheeks reddened. He glanced at the other board members. Some looked uneasy. A few seemed defiant. He flipped through his notes. "Mr. Walker," he said, trying to sound calm, "the board has determined that your greenhouse and workshop structure violate multiple guidelines. Until such time as you bring your property into compliance, we must retain those containers as a measure of enforcement." An uproar swept through the room. A few folks stood up, shouting about how it was illegal, how the HOA had gone too far. Gary tried to gavel for silence, but the momentum was unstoppable. That's when something unexpected happened. A slender man in a crisp suit stepped forward, someone I hadn't seen before. He introduced himself as Doug Reeves, an attorney specializing in property law. He said he represented a group of neighbors who were ready to file a formal complaint with the county, demanding the board's immediate compliance with fire safety regulations. "You have 24 hours, Doug said firmly, to remove those containers. If you don't, we'll request an emergency hearing. The city attorney will be notified and will seek damages for every day the driveway remains blocked." The sudden presence of a lawyer, backed by multiple residents, visibly rattled the board. Gary tried to sputter out a rebuttal, something about how the HOA's internal bylaws superseded personal claims, but Doug shut that down, explaining the difference between an HOA's covenants and local laws. Local law wins where health and safety is concerned. Another board member, a woman named Carol, leaned into her microphone, her voice shaky. Let's calm down. Perhaps we can find a middle ground. Mr. Walker, if you agree to remove part of your greenhouse extension, maybe we can revisit the container situation." That's when the entire crowd erupted again. It was clear folks weren't having it. They were tired of the bullying, tired of half-baked compromises. Gary looked cornered. The meeting devolved into a shouting match. Finally, the board had no choice but to end it abruptly, promising they'd discuss matters internally and make a decision by tomorrow. Outside, people milled around, adrenaline buzzing. Doug Reeves turned to me. "The fire marshal's violation notice should force their hand. If they don't comply, we'll proceed with legal action. Don't worry, you've got the community's support." That night, I barely slept, consumed by anxious hope. Would the HOA capitulate or dig in deeper? Come dawn, I was up early, peering out the window at those monstrous containers. To my surprise, at around 9 a.m., a flatbed tow truck rumbled onto the street, followed by a second, then a third. I rushed outside in time to see workers in reflective vests hooking chains to the containers. I spotted Gary Novak standing near the curb, phone in hand, expression sour. He refused to meet my eyes. The moment he saw me, he turned away, barking instructions at the workers. Within the hour, the containers were hauled away, one by one, leaving deep ruts in my driveway's edge. By 10 a.m., the path to my garage was clear again for the first time in 10 days. I felt a wave of relief, so intense I nearly want to drop to my knees and kiss the asphalt. Neighbors stepped out on their porches, applauding or giving thumbs up as the trucks rolled away. It felt like a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Of course, the story didn't end there. The HOA was still determined to fight me over the greenhouse and workshop, but I had a new sense of confidence and a network of neighbors who realized they didn't have to bow to every unreasonable demand. In the weeks that followed, we formed a neighborhood committee, independent of the board, to push for fairer rules and more transparency. Doug Reeves helped us draft a set of proposed amendments to the bylaws that would limit the board's power to impose extreme measures without due process. Ultimately, the shipping containers fiasco became a catalyst for change. The board's brazen overreach, blocking a homeowner's driveway, blew up in their faces, leading to widespread condemnation from within the community and local authorities alike. Several board members, including Gary, ended up resigning before the next election, presumably to avoid further public shaming. As for my greenhouse and workshop, the new, more sensible board is currently reviewing updated guidelines for outbuildings and gardens. With a little bit of good faith and compromise, I'm optimistic we can find a solution that benefits everyone, without resorting to draconian punishments. Standing in my once-blocked driveway, I sometimes still catch myself checking to make sure no monstrous steel containers have reappeared. There's a faint imprint on the asphalt where they sat, a reminder of how close I came to being shut out of my own home. But it's also a reminder that when people band together, even the most overbearing HOA can be held accountable. For all the frustration and sleepless nights it caused, the day those containers were removed was one of the sweetest victories I've ever tasted. Sure, I had to fight tooth and nail, but it proved that no matter how powerful a group of bullies might seem, they're no match for a community that refuses to be bullied anymore. The end.